Rabia, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
So before I let our guest introduce herself, a quick word about the show and myself. So I'm Phil. I'm a partner at Webisoft. We build custom software, and the topic of the innovation blueprint is, of course, innovation. But we're just interested in talking to interesting people in industries we typically target as a consulting company. Rabia, thank you so much for taking the time again. Do you want to take a few minutes, explain who you are, what you do?
Sure. So I'm Ravia. I work at Sephora, which, as you probably know, it's a cosmetics company. I
Hmm.
work in the compliance department here in Canada. Basically, we ensure that all of our products are compliant, environment-wise, safety-wise, and we just make sure that everything that's on our shelves is allowed to be on our shelves. And we do use like a number of software programs, but obviously there's so many gaps that need to be filled. So I'm really happy to be talking to you about that today.
Okay, exciting. I My only exposure to Sephora is my daughter likes that a lot, likes that brand a lot. So she always wants to go. But like how is it, from a compliance standpoint, like whether you're what maybe go through what a day looks like for you.
Well, a day for me would look like we have something called newness and existing assortments. So newness would mean all of the new product launches. So basically just keeping an eye out on all of our upcoming product launches and whether they've been reviewed in terms of their compliance. We deal with like CPAC, to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. We have
Mm.
to keep track of whether the products comply with the Canadian hot list. We have to make sure that there's no blacklist ingredients or ingredients that would require tracking. Canada is really strict when it comes to chemical substance tracking. So if you want to import anything into Canada, you have to notify the government if the one of the substances in the ingredients requires tracking and it's not on the domestic substances list. So making sure that all of our products are being actively reviewed for compliance, and then we would communicate with the different departments here at Sephora because obviously our merchant team they really want products to hit shelves already. Our planning team needs to know whether they can place POs. So we do a lot of like communication with the entire company really, and just new projects and even like brainstorming like where are our gaps in terms of like compliance when it comes to a retailer, because you would be surprised like as a brand as a retailer the um requirements are different obviously.
How often do you run into issues where you have to either like flag a product or an ingredient, or like what's the process like if something gets flagged as non-compliant?
I would say it happens quite often because we're just learning as we go. And a lot of our department, like we're restructuring now, but up until now, it's been like sort of the bandage solution. So whenever an issue comes up, we have to like brainstorm a solution and then we just do that going forward. But there's no really process in place
Or
right now. As it happens in regulatory, the regulations change so often that a lot of the times you're just like dealing with issues as they come. As soon as you have a process in place, something will change and then it won't be relevant anymore. And then you have to go back and like redo the process all over again. I would say that a pain point for us has been substance tracking as well as EPR. So
what CPR?
EPR is extended producer responsibility.
Mm.
So basically, everything that producers like Sephora have put out, like if a consumer, shopper goes into our store and buys something and then they use it up and then they put it in their recycling bin, which then the city picks up and then puts to their recycling facilities. So now there's a process in place where producers are actually responsible for, reimbursing the government for, the facilities and like the trucks that pick it up and all of the services that are involved in that process. So a lot of that, like in terms of like calculating how much you owe to the government, requires data that, as a retailer, sometimes we don't have. So we have to chase our brands who then have to chase their suppliers. So that's a problem with data, I would say, just getting the necessary info from the people who are even willing to share it or have been tracking it this whole time. And substance tracking is, of course, as I mentioned, if you're bringing something into Canada and it has a substance that's not on the domestic substances list, you have to notify the government. You have to have a tracking process in place, which we're actively working towards. But yeah, those are two things that I would say keep coming up again and again.
Mm. And so you mentioned that you often run, I guess, into like first times, right? So this first time this happens, we're kind of writing it up, you know, on the spot. And then you're saying you have to kind of throw that in the bin a few months in because the regulations change. Is that frustrating for the compliance team? I would assume it could be, right? Because it's a lot of temporary solutions.
Yeah, I would say like in cosmetics, it's obviously cosmetics, it sounds like you wouldn't think how many chemicals actually would be in one product, right? And all of these chemicals, the government cares about them. For example, every single like I don't know if you know what the Canada Gazette is, but
Hmm.
they like publish notices for chemical compliance every now and then they'll add restrictions or even bans for certain ingredients that you had no idea about. So something like for like capriol hydroxyamic acid comes to mind. It's a very, very common cosmetic ingredient, but the Canadian government recently put certain restrictions on it in terms of concentration. You had to track for it. So they just keep adding ingredients to their list of restrictions, and sometimes it's hard to like keep up. And then once that regulation goes live, you then have to work with your logistics teams and your distribution centers to like pull it off of shelves or use software to put those SKUs on hold and make sure that they're not moving. So yeah.
And so you guys are, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are an international brand, right? Like you have at very least a US presence.
Yep.
Um,
All over the world.
so is Canada one of the most difficult places to work in from a compliance perspective, or is it just different?
It's definitely different. I would say the most difficult would be the EU
Okay.
because their regulations are, well, they kind of have like teamwork there, right? The EU, all of the countries work together to, bring about all these regulations and restrictions. They're just way ahead because of the, additional resources that they have. So a lot of the times there are restrictions on fragrances, on certain ingredients, or, greenwashing environmental regulations will be way ahead of like the US and Canada. I would say US and Canada are less strict than the EU, but they're definitely not interchangeable either. I would say that like a lot of our US brands are sometimes surprised by the concept of substance tracking because that's something that, is present in Canada. In the US, I think their regulatory space is just structured differently. I'm not sure how they do it, like for cosmetics companies, whether chemical regulations would be handled separately, but in Canada they are.
Mm. And is the scope of your work limited to Canada, or do you also collaborate with the, let's say, other uh, national brands? Or
My scope of work would be Canada mostly.
okay.
Yeah.
And how did you get to that position? Like, what's your career path like so far?
Well, believe it or not, I started out in molecular genetics at the University of Waterloo.
Okay.
And I worked in a lab for about a year, but I really didn't like it just because you have to be on your feet for 8 hours per day. I was getting like 10,000 steps like per day and I was indoors. So I really did not like it. I went back to school for something that I thought would, put my BSc to use, but still, not be in a lab and not as, like technical. And so I pick regulatory affairs. I think that's a pretty like like if you need like a scientific background for regulatory affairs, but it's also, you're also involved in like business, the operation side, etc. So I went back to school for regulatory affairs and then I had a co-op in which I had a project for cosmetics. which I really enjoyed. And that experience I was able to bridge to my role at Deciem, which is the parent company of The Ordinary. And over there, I that was like regulatory affairs from a product development perspective, which is a bit different from like the retailer side, which is what I do at Sephora, but it was definitely very interesting and informative. And then from there, I came here to Sephora.
Okay, so it's kind of a natural evolution. Because the compliance is, we've met a few chief compliance officers on this show. It's a bit of a we're getting kind of specialized in that, I guess, maybe a little bit. Like, uh, really appreciate our talks with compliance because they kind of operate in a different world than the rest of the company almost. So it's fun to hear like how somebody would get this like in that particular department. Sometimes it's almost by chance. Good to hear that it was on purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I did, like you said, I did do it on purpose, but a lot of the programs, even in regulatory affairs, like in the States, there's a master's program for it. In Canada, there is a master's program, but it's at Northwestern or Northeastern University in Toronto, I think, but that's like a US university. It just has a campus in Toronto. It's a pretty underdeveloped field in terms of education here in Canada. So a lot of people don't even know that it's a thing. Like you
Hmm.
said, they just end up in it like accidentally and then they end up liking it.
Yeah, 100%. Like I think I said in a previous show, like compliance is it's kind of an afterthought in a lot of cases until it's in your face and then you kind of need it, right? Like it's not important until it is. And then it's
Until
too
you're
late.
charged.
And then
Yeah,
it's too late.
charged
Yeah.
thousands. Yeah.
So you did mention AI and technology earlier. How does your particular department use AI, and then how is it used on a company wide basis?
So I would say my department would use AI to get like a rough background of an ingredient or a regulation or to summarize a really long and tedious government
Hmm.
regulation page or notification. Obviously, you can't use AI to finalize your decision on an ingredient, for example, because it's going to pull information from different resources. And I feel like in the regulatory space, the professionals, they're there to interpret a lot of regulations,
Hmm.
which AI can't do for you. AI can like summarize the regulation itself, but when it comes down to it, the actual people need to be the ones who are going to interpret how to apply that regulation. And, for example, like I said, retailers can be a bit tricky because you would think that all the responsibility goes to the brands. But if you really get into the nitty gritty, you would have to spend a lot of times with the regulation and see how it actually does affect you as a retailer and how you can apply and interpret it and to your context, if that makes sense.
Like, what's the coolest thing that's coming out of the Sephora Labs AI, like on the AI front? Like, have you seen like a really cool use of the technology? Maybe not necessarily in compliance, but in other aspects of the business.
Honestly, I don't know how, like, to me, it's cool, but we're using Copilot now
Okay.
and we can just use it in, like, all of the programs like Microsoft Word or Outlook. And I feel like communicating with brands is a lot smoother now. Like, you can just tell Copilot what you're trying to communicate. I remember there was this really long and tedious, chain that, there was just, like, a problem in communication with a brand. They were just not understanding the concept of substance tracking. They kept saying that, like, "Oh, this is a compliant ingredient. Like, what's your problem? Why you guys keep bothering us?" So I just asked, our in-house AI called Maya. I was like, why is there such a communication gap happening? And what do I need to say so that I clarify my point properly? And it actually was able to pinpoint like where the gap in communication was and why they were confused. And I know that sounds like, oh, you're just using AI for emails. Yeah, but sometimes it's actually like, sometimes that you need a third perspective to see like
Yeah.
why two people can't get their points across, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, because like sometimes you lack perspective, right? You see your own words and you understand them obviously, but like somebody else might interpret it differently.
But we another one would be substance tracking. So
Okay.
there's a software that we're working with our consultants. So they have more insight on this. And I'm sure it does use AI. Actually, yeah, I'm confident it does use AI, but it's a software program where you would need like inputs for the substance tracking. So for your product, like the ounces, the actual chemical, the concentration, and then it tracks that substance for you throughout its life cycle.
And okay, how does it track it exactly?
So I would say that it's like a almost like bookkeeping. So if we have a product that has a certain substance in it that requires tracking by the government, we would provide this software information about like the concentration and how much of that ingredient is in it and whatever else. And then it would make sure that there's like a repository of information for that amount of ingredients, that it's present in Canada right now in this product. There's this many units that were sold in the Canadian market, and it just keeps a log of that just in case that information like is needed.
Okay, so it kind of creates the right environment to track it essentially. We'll kind of set everything up and document where documentation is needed. Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a great
Yeah.
use of AI.
Because I guess technically you could put in all of that information manually in an Excel sheet yourself, but AI is definitely going to be way better at that or more valid.
Yeah, there should not be any more manual spreadsheets
Yeah.
in your day to day. That should not be a thing.
And I feel like in regulatory, like it's so manual sometimes, especially with EPR and like trying to find the weights for all the plastic that is in the packaging. But in the future, there needs to be a solution for that for sure, because it's just too much to do by humans.
I mean, to me, it sounds like a lot can be automated because, like, typically anything digital now, like anything that happens on a in a digital world, you could use automation for now, right? Like even agents can now go and use your credentials and log in as you and do things in the different SaaS that you have, right? Like there's no real limits to what you can do. Um, so I think a solution to your problems is coming. It should it should be there in a few months, really. Um, what's your favorite software that you use at Sephora?
My favorite software that I use at Sephora? That's a good question. I would say probably Maya.
That's your in-house AI, is that it?
Yeah, it's so useful. It basically allows us to use like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. I think there's a couple others as well. And I think like the purpose is just to make sure that all of the info is, proprietary, like it's like
Hmm.
contained within our own system. So you're able to share information that, would normally you wouldn't just put into ChatGPT,
You
right?
wouldn't put it on the internet, right? So allegedly that stays local and exclusive to you guys. So that's something that the Sephora team has built, essentially.
LVMH team has, yeah. So it's for all LVMH companies to use.
Okay, okay. What's that? It's of your parent company?
Yeah. Have you heard of Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
so
what it
that's
stands for. Got it. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see I'm clearly not a big luxury brand person.
I didn't know either. That was like a fun fact that I thought Sephora, like it's such a huge company, but it's owned by an even huger company.
Makes sense, actually. That's a good fit. Okay, so they built kind of like their own proprietary AI. So it's like something you can query, and then I guess like new products and new features come out of that, and that you can then use for your, I guess, day to day. Is that it?
Yeah. And sometimes we have like during like for example, Global Learning Week, we'll have like training sessions for other programs as well. I forgot the name of one, but we had this tutorial of how to basically screen record us doing a task, and from that, it will generate an SOP for any task that, I mean, I guess you would have to execute it perfectly for, the AI to pick up what you're doing and then create an SOP out of that. And I'm sure you would edit it at the end as well. That was really cool.
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of that you can do with like typical like Claude or GPT, but
Yeah.
it's very tailored to your, yeah, that's a cool use of AI is like basically kind of specialized models, right? For brands or companies where they're trained on your data, for instance, they're trained on your way to work, and then they can really help specifically because obviously if you use ChatGPT or use something else out of the box, it's gonna help, but there's gonna be a lot of like manual edits and then back and forth and reprompting for you to get it right. And then there's no consistency necessarily uh, from output to output. So that's yeah, that's super cool. Maya. I'm gonna see if there's any documentation I can find on it. Um,
I don't think they'll let you use it.
no, probably not. But I could, maybe there's a press release somewhere. I'm curious. Um, if you could fix one inefficiency about the business you're in, so maybe compliance specifically, like what do you think is inefficient or maybe something that frustrates you about the way things are done?
I would say that the way that we gather sustainability data really needs to be, like you said, automated because right now, for example, if I were to write an SOP on how we do EPR or in Canada, FPR, which is the Federal Plastics Registry,
Hmm.
which is basically a government initiative to like collect data on all of the plastics that, an organization or um, any sort of entity has put out in the Canadian waste stream, I suppose. So it would just be me reaching out to brands, begging them to give me the information that I need, and then they fill out manually an Excel sheet. And that Excel sheet, I'm guessing they would have sent to their suppliers, which they wouldn't even have that info because sometimes I remember when I was at SCM doing EPR from a brand's perspective, we would literally need people in our production site to manually like weigh that product to then report on it, right? So I feel like if there was a way to end retain that data, so then reporting for it would be a lot smoother. So let's say that, a machine makes a product, right? So that machine should have information on the packaging, the whatever materiality is in it, right? So this is the percent of like, polyethylene, this is the percentage of polypropylene, HDPE, etc. And then that information is saved somewhere, which then the supplier can send to whoever they need to, or a brand can send to their retailers or the government. Or I feel like that data is not collected at when that actual material or product is made. Because sometimes even the final product, it's just being put together and the actual specs, the supplier of like the nozzle itself would have, or the supplier of the glass would have. But nobody actually owns the responsibility to collect that information. And so when, Canada puts out this regulation all of a sudden that, oh, by the way, we need you to report for all the plastic that you're putting out there. It's like, where do we even get that information if we haven't been tracking this whole time?
You
You know?
don't, I guess. Like, or you make it up. That-
Exactly. And
yeah.
it's funny you say that because I was looking into the regulations and there's something called the ABOM method. Basically, if I say
Is
that
it
we
the 8 ball method?
no, the
Oh,
ABOM,
okay.
ABOM method.
Bomb. Okay.
Yeah, which is funny too.
Because
But
8 ball would be, like, oh, I
yeah,
guess it's this.
it
Yeah.
kind of is like the 8 ball because it's like, for example, if I say that I sold 200 lipsticks this year and an average lipstick weighs like 8 grams, they'll just be like, okay, so I guess we will just like do 8 times by however many units you sold, which is not accurate because lipsticks packaging is different. So some lipsticks will have like
Right.
really great plastic packaging. Some lipsticks are more luxe. Some even use glass. So the data, if you compound that, inaccuracy over time is going to be really inaccurate, right?
So what's the reason you think? Because like what you're describing doesn't sound super complicated from a software standpoint, like to actually execute on a system that could do that. What do you think is the blocker? Is it just like, we've always done it this way, and I guess it's not broken, don't fix it.
I would say it's just the lack of data.
A lack of data.
Yeah. So the reason we would have to estimate is because it's hard to like each of those 800 lipsticks, we would have to reach out to the supplier for
Hmm.
their specs. So that's like 800 emails and 800 times of like inputting
Yeah.
info into an Excel sheet. So I was just say like how tedious it is. And a lot of the times the brands don't want to reply to you because it doesn't apply to them. So it's just data collection. I would say that's the biggest. Yeah.
So there's no incentive on collecting the data as you go along. Essentially, it's not worth it to most people.
Well, they just, I think they just don't know that they were supposed to be collecting this data this whole time. 'Cause, like, the
Okay.
Federal Plastics Registry regulation, it just came out, like, a year or 2 ago.
Okay.
So, before that, it's, like, brands or suppliers, they didn't know that these regulations would pop up out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And so, like, are they in trouble? Like, once they kind of realize we haven't been doing this and it's been 5 years.
Well, I feel like, for example, a supplier in China is not gonna care that a Canadian brand is in trouble.
Yeah.
Let the Canadian like, I know that the regulations will say something like, you did like, as far as your obligation goes, you should have done whatever it was possible for you to do to get the most accurate information before
Yeah.
you gave like a rough estimate, like the
Yeah.
Avon method, for
Mhm.
example. So there are like like they do realize that information is not always possible to, be accurate all the time. And sometimes like you just don't get responses. But yeah, there eventually are going to have to be consequences if people are going to change, right?
Yeah. Unless they just decide to change the regulation again, and then you don't need it anymore.
I think
But
it's just going to become more and more strict over time, especially when
probably it's doubtful that
liability.
they would do that.
Yeah.
Final question for you today, Rabia. What's an innovation in compliance or just in your industry in general that you see coming that's around the corner that you're quite excited about?
I would say I'm excited about like life cycle management, which sounds not that exciting, but I would say that like now I have like even like this is so random, but I'll have like students that are working on their like final project in fourth year and they decided to do like a cosmetics regulatory software program. And and that's how I know it's around the corner because I've seen it up close. And they'll be the whole program will have information on all the company's assortments. So we can just put in information on like what the ingredients are, and then they'll use AI to like get um information on the restrictions of those ingredients across the world. So in Canada, what are the restrictions and rules with this ingredient? In the US and EU, so they'll be able to link those to your product's homepage, and they even like added a section for EPRs. So what is the packaging made out of? And um yeah, like I would say just having one place where you can house all of your compliance information. So you don't it's not in like random different Excel sheets in your computer. It's like in one program.
Right. So centralizing to like one, and you don't have that currently, like one compliance like app or software that kind of centralizes all that. No.
No, I would say it would just be because regulatory affairs and compliance is so multifaceted.
Hmm.
Like I said, there's environmental regulations that sometimes overlap with chemical regulations, which are a lot more broad. There's, product safety, which and like labeling compliance, packaging compliance. It's all very, very different. So far, there hasn't been one software program that houses every single thing that you would need for one cosmetic product, believe it or not. Even though it seems simple enough, I haven't seen it so far.
Okay. Maybe something that your group will put together. If they watch this episode, right? And they'll be
Yeah,
like, "Oh, that's a good idea.
maybe I'll code for it.
We'll include it in Maya." Well, you're not, the fun thing is you could probably code it with Claude, right? Claude Code. You could essentially now, like, what we see happening more and more is we have either our clients or even some of our staff internally that are not necessarily technical. We'll put together a prototype with AI, and then they'll give it to our tech team, and so, like, most of the front end work, most of the logic work is done, and then it's just about like making it, actually function. Um, but it speeds up, from idea to production now is much, much, much faster. So you could put together a prototype. I'll give you an idea now. Is you know start playing with Claude and like tell it like this is I want to build software that does this, and then you'd probably get a functional front end prototype that you can then present to your group, and then maybe if they like it, they'll send it to the dev team and actually execute it. That could be cool.
That's super cool. Thanks for the idea. I might get a raise just from that.
There we go. I'm here to help. Rabia, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. It was great talking to you.